I got it. Okay, so tonight, as we sort of email around, we'll touch base on the process and the timeline, and I have an updated version of the timeline that we've been going through that has a lot more detail with respect to when we need to notice things, and has sort of our target dates for public hearings and things like that. And then we'll go through the draft code outline. Believe it or not, this is like most of the code. We're missing, I think, 2 sections and definitions. So that we'll touch on, and then we'll just start going through part 2. So with that, I'll jump into the timeline itself. And rather than go through these, I think it's just going to make more sense if we go through this table, which I have copies of, so I'll pass that around. Okay. Here's page 1 through. Okay. So the first page is just what occurred in 2018, so you can skip that. And then the second page brings us to almost exactly where we are right now. So this is sort of the history of all the meetings and the documents that we've been going through for the past 5 months. And now, as we are into May, we have, on the comprehensive plan side, there's at least one more meeting that they're going to have to review that draft document, and they're charged with getting me the comments that they have on that document by the 20th, so that we can then turn that around and have that revised draft plan ready by the 28th, so that we can have that posted to the village website for the open house and public hearing.
Have they given any indication that that's a date they can hit?
So there was an email that I got that said there were some individuals that I think were uneasy about meeting that date, but I did stress that that's kind of the hinge on what this timeline is based on. And the other piece of that too is, we're not supposed to have a completely wrapped, zipped up, done and done plan and code for the open house. The intent is to say, look, we're almost done. We want you to look at what we've done and tell us whether we're right or wrong. So
it allows the public to give more meaningful input.
yes, and so I feel like maybe some of that, and maybe I just not interpreting things correctly, but I feel like some of that hesitation is because people are looking for a very polished, final, we're good with every I and dot and T in the document, but I don't think that that's necessarily where we need to be. And I don't think it's where we should be, because if I were someone from the public and I came and you're telling me that this is a 98% done document, I'm not going to feel all that great about putting in my input. And that was the same with the code. So the other piece, and I don't know if we've talked about this here, kind of sprung it on the committee at our last meeting, so we hadn't actually talked about it yet. They are required by New York State law to also hold a public hearing, because they are a committee that was appointed to do the comprehensive plan update process. So by New York State law, they have to hold their own public hearing, and then they make a motion to formal resolution to recommend the document to the village board for consideration for adoption. So we worked with them to plan for that to occur. The public hearing can occur after that open house. You can just use that room, have a table set up. It'll be pretty easy transfer, I think, to have that happen. And then if they aren't comfortable making a motion that evening, that's fine. We've set aside a date sometime during the week of the 18th, I think was discussed, to have that final meeting to talk about the public input and have that resolution happen. So then,
does anybody else besides the committee and you need to review that draft plan before the 28th?
no. I'm assuming you mean like county and things like that. No.
County,
No.
lawyers, nobody?
No. That would all be what we have planned ahead of the hearings. So just alongside with that, where we are right now, this is our 11th meeting, believe it or not. And we're working through the part 2 and the zoning map. So for all intents and purposes, we have parts 1, 2, and 3 of 4 done. Part 4 is just the definitions. So going through with this document with you tonight, we can set aside another date at some point in the next couple of weeks to keep going through this or to revise it further so that you're comfortable with it. And then we will essentially have the same deadline for getting the draft code in a position. Again, it doesn't have to be 90%, but get the draft code in a position to go to the public. And one thing that we felt we could do is keep the definitions till after the open house, because that's sort of the highlight of the minutia of the document. So if someone wants to talk to us about definitions and make comments on definitions, we're more than happy to do so, but more or less, as we talked about the format of the open house, we're going to try to create, as best we can, a one-for-one comparison, and you'll see a similar approach to that tonight in our presentation going through the part 2, a one-for-one comparison between how the comprehensive plan community enhancement strategy relates to the zoning code and how that community, that character area has been interpreted as a zoning district. So it will be right in front of the public's eyes and how that matches, and I like the way that we've done this as well, because the design standards with these districts will also be helpful in relating to the community character areas. So with that said, we would, in order for the steering committee to hold their public hearing on the 13th, that does need to be noticed by the 23rd. Dorothy told me said that she needs about 20 days ahead to make sure it gets into the newspapers and things. So the 23rd of May will need to be the public notice deadline for that committee public hearing. And then we can just get the drafts up on the village a few days after that. So then we have the public open house and the public hearing. Then we get into any of the recommendations from the public that the committee wants to incorporate. We can do that. We will finish and come through with you with the definitions and the same thing, talk about public feedback if there's anything we want to incorporate. And so towards the end of June is when we'll be looking at the draft plan and the draft code, and we'll need the local law that essentially goes with the zoning code so that it can be adopted, the language for that.
Jeff, is that enough time for you?
Enough time for me.
It is?
Yep.
So between, you're going to get late May, gives you almost a full month.
Yep.
And you're not bothered to not get the definitions till the end?
I'm assuming, I didn't want to say anything, I'd be getting the definitions ahead of time and working on them a little bit,
Sure. Yeah, we can do that.
which is essentially what you said I came out with.
Yeah.
And if, when you send Jeff the definitions, if you would also keep me in the loop?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll do is I'll send it to everyone. I mean, we just don't want to, given the fact that this right here is kind of a time crunch with what we have going on with the comprehensive plan element of this, we just felt that the definitions, we can just hold back on that until after the public hearing. So I'm not going to withhold definitions from you until the end of June. We'll talk about them, we'll send them. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure that that wasn't, it's clear that that's not something we're going to talk about pre-open house.
Nor does it have to be, I think, but it's a really important part of the code, obviously, so,
Definitely.
you know, taking a hard look at it.
Yeah, but our experience with, community meetings and open houses, nobody ever asked about the definitions. It'll be the map and the districts and what can I do on my property and what can't I do.
I want to make sure that because there are nationally accepted definitions of preservation developed by the Department of the Interior, I want to make sure that our definitions are in line with national standards.
Okay.
But to that point, Bob, I think we've already got those definitions in the HPRB code that the board has already adopted.
I think when we developed them, we looked at the Park Service standards.
So I don't know that we have to do any more lifting on that thing. That would be my thought.
As long as those definitions are being transferred into the new document.
Yeah,
Oh, yes.
let's not get down further than that, but Molly and I kind of emailed about that issue. and I think
Okay.
We're okay.
Okay, good.
Okay, so with that, then we will have the draft plan and draft code with the local law enabling language moving forward into the formal review process. So it will have the village board at this point, and both of these documents, for all intents and purposes, will be considered jointly. say, so seeker ties them in terms of the action, so we're gonna do the same thing for how we deal with, the public hearings and things. So at the end of June is when we'll start going through that, draft seeker documentation. We can kind of prepare sort of our first look and thoughts, and we'll give that to you, so, you can go through that. And we will also need to have the coastal assessment form completed, for that referral to the, PZBA. So our deadline for that referral,
Molly?
yes,
We're gonna do two CAFs? One
two separate ones, okay.
For, no, that was a question.
Oh, I don't know, cause,
I think we should probably do one for the comp plan amendment adoption and one for the code.
so.
That's just administrative.
So the one thing that I thought that I might do one is because the way that the LWC language reads, it defines the action as the single action by the board. So I wasn't sure if, since we're considering the action under seeker as a joint action, if we would do the same for
Yeah,
CAP.
we'll flesh it out.
Okay.
When I look at this and I look at your deliverables,
Mhm.
John and Molly, for May and June, there's a lot in there for you guys. You have to revise, you have to look at all the revisions. You've got to manage the open house, right? You've got to help with the seeker documentation in the CAP. Is that too much for you guys, or is that comfortable?
No, it's fine. I mean, that's the one thing that is good about where these documents are at this point, is that, you know, I don't hope that the committee is not gonna come back to us on the 20th of having completely gutted or wanting to rewrite parts of the plan. Certainly, we anticipate having to edit and add pages or massage pages and content here and there. But the actual edits to these things is probably the least of our worries as part of this. The seeker will, you know, I mean, we want to put some thought into that. That's not all too difficult. And the same with drafting the definitions. So, no,
It's manageable.
yeah, we're good.
So,
Yeah.
so this really does hinge on the comp plan finishing up when they say, because at the last meeting, last week was, the conclusion was, well, we could wait, maybe a week or two. And I did let them know that we had a timeline built around that. And it was split. I don't know if you were there last time, but it was split around the table, and it was split last night, but it was a much smaller group about whether they thought they were ready or not. Now, Tom wasn't there, and since that previous meeting, you did let him know that you didn't recommend delaying. So I think they're meeting again on Monday,
Mhm.
or we are, the whole committee. I think it would be good to touch base with Tom since he wasn't there yesterday, just to underscore
Yeah,
the
definitely.
part that you said, which is, because I think you're right, the feeling around the table is that, oh my God, this isn't finished yet, we can't, like,
Right.
it's like a doctoral dissertation, it's never gonna be finished, but, the whole idea of that it needs to be this polished thing before it goes out to the public,
Right.
and that we're done.
Yeah, no, so that's, I guess, yeah, so we should reiterate to them that, you know, we will obviously have that meeting to review public feedback and any additional thoughts they have. And the one thing, you know, I would say about the open house, the document going towards the open house, is that if there were a lot of people on the committee who were saying, there's whole parts of this we disagree with, that would be a reason to hold the public open house back. If it's, we just want to make sure this picture's in there, or we want to highlight the LWRP more, that kind of stuff, we can deal with after the fact. So, but yeah, no, we will definitely do that. And the one thing I will note, I mean, with the moratorium extension, we did talk about taking that into mid-October, right? So this does make the assumption that we're ending in the end of August. So if something crazy happened and whatever, we have about a month contingency to deal with. But we'd like to obviously get it done sooner rather than later. So once we have the draft plan, draft code, we will have in the draft secret part 1, we'll go through and make that referral to the PZBA. They have, by definition, 60 days, so they would have till August 30th. This timeline sort of assumes that they wouldn't take all 60 days, but again, we can adjust that if necessary. And then we would also make the referrals to Monroe County, and their deadlines are very flexible, so they only require 30 days to look at the documents as well. So we will need to make sure we're noticing the first public hearing of the village board regarding the plan and code by July 2nd, with the intent of holding that on the 23rd. And I just based this off of what your continuing board schedule seemed to look like.
And
So
the PZBA would need to notice when.
they don't. To my understanding, I don't know if they have a public hearing. Jeff, do they have a public hearing as part of
I'll
the
check.
LWC? If they do, we can just build that in.
I stole your pen, Jeff.
It's okay.
You are.
Yes, correct.
And then from there, so I put the scheduled planning board meetings in here just as a point of reference. And then if the planning board is okay and they make their determination through the CAF, and it's all's well and good, and it's sent to the village board, I would say, by early August, then we'd be good to go with holding the second public hearing and essentially taking action for adoption on the 13th, which happens to be my birthday. Or otherwise, if necessary, we can kick that out to a second meeting at the end of August.
What are the known risks
No public hearing.
in this plan besides the SC not meeting the 20th of May?
So it would be if the SC wants to push out the open house and the hearing, and it would be if the planning board holds on to their CAF review for the full 60 days. If they did hold on for the full 60 days, then the board wouldn't get it till the end of August. So you would just be looking at your second public hearing in September.
Can we confirm, we don't have to do an LWRP? We talked about that before. So we don't know. Do we?
I think Justin Valestra thinks that we do.
Yeah, he does.
So
It is
that's-
an LW, the local waterfront consistency.
Consistency.
That is what the CAF is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but that's
No,
just
that's
the, yeah, that's,
No, the
No,
local
no.
waterfront consistency law requires that any action that you're taking, you need to fill out the coastal
Yeah.
assessment form and forward that to the planning board, and they make a determination.
of whether they need an LWRP or not, based on that, because they have,
No,
that's a public hearing too.
It
isn't
determined, Jeff said it's not. They're making a determination whether or not what's in the plan and the code is consistent with the LWRP.
Right.
It doesn't hinge on anything with the LWRP, it's just whether or not.
And that doesn't need to have that's not a public hearing?
No.
We've only done one of those ever.
It's not, do you remember, did you do a public
We
hearing?
did do a public hearing. No, did we? Oh, crap, I don't remember. I
You
feel
sure?
like it was a public hearing.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's required.
Let me look it up real quick. We've only
just-
ever done one.
I just took a quick run through the,
Okay, let me look it up real quick on the,
I think that might have been a little bit more complex because it was tied into a litigation and we were fulfilling a judge's order to
Huh.
go back
so that's
and
why it had to be.
take
public.
care of something that was not taken care of the first
All right,
time.
let me look it up.
just looked through real quick, there's no public hearing minutes, but let me take another look.
No public hearing needed by the PZBA.
That's what we're trying, right.
That's my
I just want to make
interpretation.
sure that was.
But that seems consistent to me in the sense that that is a action of a recommendation, it's not a final decision. So most things that are final decisions are the things that require the public hearing. That being said, doesn't mean you couldn't if you wanted to.
I think you're talking about two different things. It had to be a public hearing because we were recreating
No
a
public hearing.
step that did not occur. So
I'm sorry?
the 75 Monroe, the LWRP, that had to be a public hearing because they were recreating a step that had not occurred in the first review. So it did not have to be,
Did not, it doesn't have to be a
Okay.
public
it
hearing.
did not have to be.
No, the step is that the CAF goes to the planning board, the application materials, and then they have 60 days to render a consistency determination. It doesn't talk about having a public hearing.
So, and with that same thing, the one thing that this timeline doesn't take into consideration, obviously the planning board meets planning, zoning board of appeals meets once a month, they could call a special meeting, and that might help with the time frame. You know, if they get it and they determine that they, you know, we wanna do a public hearing or something, we could build a special meeting or something into this timeline. But, yeah. So I would say the answer to your question then, Dan, is that, you know, again, if the steering committee decides to push out the open house and their hearing, and if the planning board either states that they want to have a public hearing, or they take the full 60 days in their review.
It's not an application, but where an application would require a public hearing.
Right, but they could request to hold
Sure,
one, right?
yeah.
So you would just have to build notice time in for that. And we could work around that, I think, easily. It would probably behoove them to have it be a special meeting. And we can deal with that, so.
What if they take the 60 days and come back with wanting revisions or rejecting certain things? Because there's no revision based on their input in the plan.
Personally, I think they'd be hard pressed to tell us that it's inconsistent, because we frequently reference and incorporate the local waterfront revitalization plan as part of these documents. And we've made the applicability of the local waterfront boundary.
You spent time in
I know.
He's thorough. He's very thorough.
I know. So if that were the case, then that's why we have, you know, the opportunity to do these two public meetings. If that came back and we, you know, you've had your first public hearing and they've given their either a contrary recommendation or they're requesting changes, then we can take some time in August to do that. So like I said, I mean, I really want to be aggressive with this to get us to a full stop August, no snafus, and that way, if there is something that for whatever reason, you know, we need to take, so we can't have that second public hearing in the end of August, we're gonna take some time to think about their feedback and incorporate that, or not. That is obviously also the village board's discretion, to put that into, August, or September.
Going back to the prior risk, the joint public open house on the 13th of June, you mentioned that was a risk that the SC might not want to do it then. Why wouldn't they? Because they don't feel it's done?
Yeah, there's a
Is that
fear.
simple?
I like the thesis, the doctoral thesis.
I think there's a little bit of that. I mean, it's like, and the fear that something's missed or whatever. I definitely feel like it's, oh my God, it's not a polished product. And the team is split, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna say
It
this,
feels right.
it seems to me when we are in, comprehensive, plan committee meetings, that there are some who are really, like, into the nitty gritty of it. They want it to be pitch perfect reading as Pittsburgh before we go public. And, you know, that level of review is certainly wanted by us, and we appreciate that. But I think that there's, you know, others that are realizing that maybe it can be a little more flexible than that, going into the open house. I also don't know if there are some people, I think, who are expecting things of the comprehensive plan that it won't do. So some of that we're gonna have to manage expectations.
I think there's some confusion about the difference between the comp plan and the zoning code update.
Yes, I would agree.
I liked your idea, your approach, and I think it would be helpful for the comp plan committee to know that you were going to do that side-by-side comparison. And I think the public's
Yeah.
concerned too. The whole purpose of the moratorium was to do the comp plan so it could inform the code changes.
Yep.
And the steering committee is very concerned that that gets translated, so you're side-by-side.
Yeah, and we talked
They
about
would be-
that in the last committee meeting. So there was a lot of questions about the committee wanted to see the code before. So, and that's when we talked about the idea that it would be side by side. So yeah, so maybe it's worth, you know, communicating with Tom and seeing where everybody is on that, letting him know. And, you know, we can, I mean, it's a little early for us to draft the boards, but we could flesh out a little bit of the idea.
I think just knowing that you're gonna do that will be helpful.
Okay.
For us to see that.
So, I don't wanna spend too much time on the timeline, but are we, comfortable with this?
Yeah.
And we're good? Okay. Good, cause it
And it's the
was
first time you're seeing it, so if you see some,
Yeah.
if you have more questions, let
So
us know.
it's- hurting my brain for a little bit.
No, it's very thorough, thank you.
It's not a Gantt chart.
No, it's,
Again, chart would help. We had a lot of talk about Gantt charts before you got here.
okay.
We can do a SWOT analysis.
The second piece that I have for you is the updated outline of the code, and I felt that this was important to review for a couple reasons. One, we kind of switched, so we've come at this code from all different angles throughout this process.
At least 4.
And it's good because I think it's resulted in a really great package of information and regulations. But because we are including the development standards and design standards as part of the districts, we didn't need all 5 volumes. And we talked about making the volumes parts and yada yada. So volume 1 and part 1 is the same as it's always been. It'll continue. As such, the part 2 is obviously what we sent you. That's your district and district and use regulations, including your development standards. So, development standards by district. The one thing we haven't touched on or discussed is that plan development district, which is your current, not incentive,
Special purpose, it's performance.
Performance
overlay district.
There it is. The performance overlay district, for all intents and purposes, reads just like a plan development. So we would kind of make that transfer, but we can have that conversation because I know there's a lot of buzz about the incentive zoning thing going around as well. So we can talk about merits of that as well. And then the last piece of that is that certain use regulations, and that's really what we've talked about, where those additional, if it's this kind of use and you're by a residential use, you've got to be X much further away or provide a much larger screening, landscaping. It'll have all those standards. It'll have requirements.
Home occupation.
Home occupation, so, limiting, you can't have 5 people showing up to your house every day to work out of your office. So those kinds of limitations on uses. We had previously sent around something like that. We reviewed the certain use, it was Article 25, I think, at the time. But it'll essentially be an amended version of that.
And that's delivered on the 13th as part of revised part 2?
Yeah,
Okay.
yep, yeah. Our next meeting and when that's done, we have to talk about when we're gonna meet again. So those two are just flexible there, but.
Hey Molly, you know what would really be great on this?
Yeah.
Is if you put a number next to each line, a number of revisions that we've done on those sections. Because,
Oh, God.
no, just hear me out. Because when we're talking about why we're extending, and we can show how many cuts we've taken in each of these, it makes for a more compelling argument.
Well, but, I see what you're for the
For
moratorium.
the
Right.
moratorium meeting.
Can you do that, Molly, with all that?
Or is it too much of a forensic exercise?
If you let me broad brush it a little, because some of these we've done independently, some of them we've done in chunks, and some of,
Maybe there's a solution to that that comes to you at a future date.
I'll think about it.
Okay, thank you.
And then we already talked about definitions. So those are the 3 sections of the code that aren't drafted, even though they are. They exist in the realm of the code, but we just haven't looked at them formally. And I just want to make the note for you, Jeff sent me an email making the note that the variances and appeals and interpretation piece really is part and parcel, word for word, New York State law. So rather than, running the risk of your code falling out of sync with that, we're just going to reference the New York State village law process and sections for that. So what was 36 and 38 are just now going to be 36, and it'll be a reference, and all that stuff will go away.
Great.
Okay. So any questions on the draft outline, where we have code? I put this together today. I was like, wow,
It's a lot there.
done a lot.
Yeah.
So, okay, cool.
Thank you.
All right, so then we'll just jump right into, the draft?
Before we go there, Molly, I took a look at the map and I have some corrections, and it's quick, but we could cover it quickly. I think it's much improved. My suggestions, and I'll give you this. I think we should call out the village boundary, because that's also the boundary of the village historic district, okay?
But they aren't synonymous.
Yes, they are.
Yep.
Don't
The whole-
forget, there's a National Register district, which is separate. The village historic district, the local district, is the entire village. So
Got
there's
it.
another category.
Okay, yeah, so we gotta add, so technically, the whole village border should be the Pittsburgh Village Historic District, and then the red should be the National Register.
Correct,
Okay, got it.
correct.
Okay,
Okay, next, down here at the Little League field,
yeah,
that parcel actually comes down here, so there's a little triangle that should actually be open space also. That, what is the last lot, the triangle-shaped yellow lot, that should be green.
okay,
And again, I've noted it here.
okay.
I think on the north side, I think this is an error. I think you probably wanted to make this area medium density residential, because it has some very small lots in here, the north part of the village.
Actually,
Which one, B1 or B2?
It's actually, right now, it's shown as R1, but I was guessing it should be R2.
nope, you're right.
Yep,
I
okay,
had a reverse fix for that, but you're right, that is
okay,
correct. Okay,
all
yep.
right.
So that should be R2?
So that should be R2 up top, yep.
And then lastly, on the Erie Canal Heritage, because we have, the Village Historic District, the National Register District, I'm worried that if we call the Erie Canal a Heritage District, we're gonna create confusion.
Okay,
So I would suggest we call that the Erie Canal Waterfront.
You don't want to use the word heritage, the Canal Corps uses heritage. You don't like that term?
Well, what I don't wanna do is confuse people that, wow, this is the only part of the village that's heritage. So I think it makes sense to call it waterfront. In the purpose section, we'll have heritage in there, so it'll be in the code. But I think for the title, I think Erie Canal Waterfront really best describes what it is.
yeah, okay.
I agree.
And then lastly, I have a question. What is permitted in the boutique office residential district?
We'll talk about that.
Okay, because I have some concerns about that.
Yeah,
Let me ask you-
Especially the boutique element, because, and I'll just state it right now. With retail, there's a need to have visibility in storefront windows, and there's a danger that we could destroy. The intent of that district when it was created in the 70s was to preserve the historic character of those homes.
yes, so that district, and we'll get to it, actually reads as the intent is to preserve the residential character, and retail uses are not permitted.
Okay,
It's more office, if you're gonna have your dentist in there or something, I don't know.
okay, because when I see the word
Lawyer.
boutique, I think gift shop.
Yeah,
See, and I think that they're using the word more generically now to designate size, like boutique hotel, boutique
Okay,
inn,
okay,
boutique.
okay.
It's just to designate some
Okay,
smaller
okay,
size.
okay.
And it is confusing because
I mean,
it's
we could strike boutique, that's fine, it could just be office residential, that's fine.
I'll just give you that.
Oh, perfect, thank you. Yeah, I mean, if you are more comfortable with it just being, office/residential district, we can make it
I
that.
think that's fine, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Straight for the boutique.
okay,
Molly,
yes.
in the zoning code, there's a section dealing with ponds, is that gonna go somewhere else? I think we need to deal with that.
Yes, no, that goes in the certain use regulations.
Okay.
Yeah, so all the stuff that's in the code, that's like the things that are left over that deal with gas stations and
Okay.
all that stuff is
Yeah,
all gonna go in.
thanks.
Yep. And I have basically I have a working document, the entire code, and what I do is I go through and I delete everything that we've addressed, so if there's anything left when we have the draft code, I will let you know, but most of the time, there's not. So, okay. Before we kind of kind of get into the actual pages of this document, I just want to sort of walk through quickly how these relate to each other, because I know that there might have been some confusion in what we were basing the draft districts on. So the draft districts don't align with your existing map in any way. The numbers that are on your existing map do not correspond to this draft code. So what is currently R1 for you now is not R1 by this code. So they are named similarly, but don't think of them as synonymous. They are, however, attached to the community enhancement strategy. And what we tried to do, and I actually tell a lot of communities not to do this, but I think this is the perfect thing for Pittsburgh to do, is tie the names of your districts with your character areas as well. So you'll see the map of the community enhancement strategy follows very similarly that of the zoning code, albeit this is where we start to get into much more defined parcel boundaries and things. So, for example, residential districts, disregard this piece. That will be updated on the zoning map, so that will go away. It'll be reversed. Okay. So we have your low-density residential areas, which are tied to the low-density residential neighborhoods. The low-density residential district uses a lot of the same language as the low-density residential section of the comprehensive plan. And, we pulled, these are some of the sample images that we put in the comprehensive plan. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about when what we're permitting and the kind of character development we'd like to see and continue to preserve in the low-density residential district. I'm not going to read all of these.
Yeah, no.
Okay. I think if you wanted me to, I would, but I don't know.
We can either.
So then in the residential, continuing residential districts, you've got your medium density residential district, and we talked about this last time, this does not include two-family anymore. So both R1 and R2 are single-family districts, it's just that the lot sizes in R2 that are permitted are a little bit smaller, as currently exists. The one note also,
So what are the lot sizes in R2, and how did you come up with the number that you selected?
so we went through and using the GIS information, looked at the actual numbers of square footage and width of all of these lots. And what the current number was, is there was a large number of them, at least over 25% that were non-conforming. So we took a number that brought most of them into conformance, but we didn't go to the lowest common denominator.
Okay, one of the exercises that we need to do is also figure out how many lots could be subdivided under the new regulations.
You did that.
Well, but I'm wondering if you have a new formula, I'll do it again for the
No,
new
it's
formula.
it's the same as what you saw before. So that wouldn't have changed, and that's why we're adjusting. So you had gone through here, and we removed a lot of parcels in the original zoning map that essentially could be subdivided under R2, and so that's why this piece in the comprehensive plan will go away. It'll be our low density in the comprehensive plan.
But I still will want to take another look at that, because I am concerned about splitting up lots, because that affects the historic integrity of neighborhoods, and it could jeopardize our status as a CLG. It could also result in us being removed from the National Register if we start plopping in new houses among historic houses, because it would have a significant effect on the integrity of the neighborhood. So I think before we approve this, we'll do the work. But we want to do that exercise before we come up with an actual, is there a reason we're going to smaller lots?
Because that's what's existing. What we've made the numbers is reflects what's there. We didn't take the number of these and make it smaller. Your number was too big for what already exists there.
I understand.
So we just made it a little bit, reflect a
All
little
right,
bit more what's there.
let me take a look at it, and then let's revisit this conversation.
Okay.
Can we put that on the project plan? So when would when would he need to get that information?
Well, I could do my review by sometime next week, by the end of next week. I would hope it won't take me long.
So into next week is like the 18th.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
I'm gonna project manage you on that one, Bob.
That's fine.
So, again, the mixed density residential district now reads, similarly, but in this case, the difference, essentially the large difference is where your your R1 pattern, is those larger lots, the mixed density, or medium density, excuse me, allows for slightly smaller, as it currently exists. And then, these are, again, some of the samples that we've included in the comprehensive plan. So all single-family character, maintained. The R3 district, your mixed density residential, only applies here to 75 Monroe. And this is the one district or character area that we talked about allowing potentially some of that higher density or mid-density residential to be mixed in. So the purpose statement goes through many things, but then, talks about allowing for maybe 2, 3, 4 units in one structure, or maybe it's attached single-family housing. A lot of those elements are included as part of that. And we also amended this, I think we had that discussion about not wanting commercial in that area, because it would just be too much in terms of traffic and intensity of use. So this district now reads it's more purely a residential district.
Didn't that one say limited low impact commercial for that one? I thought it did.
We made it
Or was I looking at an old version?
limited low impact commercial uses, which refers to, if I get to the actual copy of it. Oops. So, that's talking about like art, music, or photo studio, a bed and breakfast, right? Home occupation, an office, but there's no like retail piece of that. The 1-2 thing that we could talk about it, but it would be like a personal service establishment, especially permitted in this case. So we took out anything that would be more of a restaurant. I mean, that's not included, things like that.
I agree with all of that. The one thing I would add though, Molly, is that we have been told by our special counsel on the 75 Monroe project that adopting any code changes should happen after our legal issues with 75 Monroe are extinguished. So we'll want to get their blessing before we actually adopt that code. It's possible that might be done by the time we get to the end of this process. It may not,
Okay.
but it's something we need to be cognizant of.
Okay. I also like to. I was looking at R4. I meant R3. There's actually nothing in there.
It's called R4 now, so we knew what you meant.
Right, so there's nothing, even though it says you can put low impact commercial uses, but aren't they all crossed out? What's allowed in there? Just, that's what I was
So I guess
confused
that's
about.
not really. Yeah, we can strike that. That makes sense to strike that from
To strike which,
from the purpose statement.
the low impact residential?
Yeah.
Is that,
Or
is that what
commercial.
you
Low
want?
impact commercial?
Yeah.
Does the comp plan reflect, they're still fleshing that out, aren't they?
I think the comp plan committee supported having services for residents
Right,
be
yes,
allowed.
right, so then it should stay in, we just need to have.
But
the
what I would
table.
describe it as services for residents. So if it was an exercise room.
A bodega.
Yeah, exactly.
So they could have a little, what do you mean by bodega, could it be a little convenience store in there? Okay. Bodega sounds way cooler, but,
It does.
yeah, so just the graph, whatever the little use.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Would that get a line on it that explicitly says low impact? Or
No,
is
well, so what we can do is, we'll go through, we could, specifically identify, like a bodega or a cafe, and the one thing I would recommend, if it's not already in there, is the floor square footage restriction.
I would say resident services. Call it resident services
Okay.
and then spell out examples of what might be allowable.
And I like the square foot idea.
Yes, it's appropriate, a scale.
Are these still specially permitted? You would still seek a special use permit?
Yeah, we can do that. Okay. All right, and then the final residential district is that boutique office residential, and this is really the only one that doesn't have a direct one-to-one with the CES, and that's because this essentially is the micro planning that of the future land use that really doesn't need to happen in the plan. We've sort of identified this through as a transition area. The plan does talk about both of these commercial districts having transitional areas and having maintaining that residential character. So that's essentially what this reads. So will now be the office residential district. Essentially, it's not only permits the continuation of residential uses, but it also allows for commercial uses of a limited scale, mainly just offices.
Let's get a new picture because this house, this is inappropriate, that's inappropriate.
I was
That's
gonna delete
replacing
that because I
I'm
let Katie
sorry.
leave it, but that's in Webster and I hate it every time I drive by it, but I was gonna delete it, I'm like, Bob's gonna say
I was
something.
surprised how they pick up on the handicap ramp rail.
Yeah.
Should.
Good,
I
okay.
think that's what.
You change your mind, there's a pool up there.
It's a jacuzzi. Yeah, no, this actually isn't in the plan. Katie Katie helped me put these together, so she put some pictures in. That's funny, because I make fun of that every time I drive by it at my parents' house. Okay. Do we want to talk, let's do that. Let's talk uses and standards with the residential districts before we jump into office, or business, unless,
Yeah, that's fine, I have a question.
yeah, okay.
Do you have an extra zoning map and,
There should be one in the middle. I brought 10.
oh, there we go, thank you.
Is it confusing to have the mixed-use office / residential as a business district rather than a residential district?
Well, because the office residential, that's a good question. And the reason why we left this in the office residential district is because it's really intended to look like a residential district. It was formally established as residential homes, there were residential uses, we're just through, allowing sort of a reuse of that property in a way that's consistent with the residential character.
Why don't you make B4 mixed-use office and then allow residents to use?
Because we want the resident to be the first part.
Yep.
So if,
It's the second part.
right, but so like if you're looking to do, the emphasis is on the fact that it's a residential district, it's not.
No, I'm talking about the mixed-use office residential.
Mixed-use office residential is a business district that allows residences.
Right, that was my point. Why don't you call it mixed-use office and then make residential a use in the mixed-use office? Because it's kind of confusing to see this is a business district.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, that's okay, yep. I can do that. Okay. So let's do.
Molly,
Yes,
I have a question.
sure.
We used to have, B1 used to be like this.
Mm-hmm.
And we split Main Street because the buildings on Main Street are zero lot line, they have storefronts. Those in this area are houses that have been converted.
Mm-hmm.
How have you kept the standards for storefronts here, but not imposed them over here? The other difference is the buildings over here have parking, and that was another distinction, whereas the buildings on South Main Street, almost none of them have parking.
Yeah.
So we had more flexible parking requirements here than over here.
Okay, yep. So, what we did with the actual requirements. We're jumping ahead here. Is make, in this case, the lot pieces, site plan review defined. So that it's basically what exists there now is conforming, don't change it. It's if it were infill development were to happen, then that would be done through site plan review.
So
That, it sounds like that's probably what you want to happen. What would you say the maximum setback of those
homes on State Street,
yeah,
20 feet.
okay, so we can just up that number then, and that'll work, okay.
So you don't want to differentiate South Main Street area, which was previously B1A, any longer?
That's a good question, because we have this similar, sort of thought process with, Shane Place.
Right, between Northfield Common
Northfield Common and, 25. One of the things, so within the district itself, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't make that distinction, because I backed off a little bit on Shane Place with the hard requirements and did more of that site plan review approach, because again, new development is gonna be, something that's just gotta be a little bit more flexible. And so carving out subsets for the design standards, it sounds like we need to try and find a way to do that for that section of downtown and the Shane Place section of Shane Place. John, what do you think of, for the purpose of the design standards only, having it be an overlay for the smaller scale development, like in downtown and in Shane Place? So essentially, like how Shane Place is, we're allowing a little bit more density, taller structures. Same thing with downtown. We've got Main Street, more density, taller structures, more of a small scale residential feel on State. Same with Northfield Common, not residential, but you know what I mean? So yeah, so it would be, we could carve out essentially that B1A, and it would be an overlay for the purpose of the design standards.
I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Because one of our goals here as the village as a historic cultural landscape is to recognize the distinct hierarchical pattern of the village. And it's something that intuitively or unconsciously we all recognize when we come here, but we may not be able to articulate it. But I think that's the failure of the CAF zoning, is to recognize that. And it's certainly something, State Street feels very different from South Main Street. And somehow I think the code needs to recognize that.
No, you're right.
As we said from the beginning, what we want is zoning based on what's on the ground.
Yep. Yeah, and that's helpful to me, because those were the two sort of last pieces that, again, you're trying to sort of like wedge it in with a shoehorn and it doesn't fit both. So I think the overlay sounds like it might work to be able to separate out those standards for those areas.
Okay.
So then what you'll see when we change it on the map is the boundary that was the 1A will just, it'll be hashed or something so that it's
Do a
separate.
little overlay and
Yep.
okay.
Yep, yeah. Okay.
And then the same in the Northfield Common?
Yes.
Inside the B4?
Yep.
It would become B4A or something similar to that, name it?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, we could, it could be the design overlay or, something like that. Yep. Easily can do that. So, how much of this, just sort of kind of get an idea of where everybody's at reading through this, has everybody gotten through all of it, or no?
No, I haven't even touched it because I
Okay.
had other priorities. So
Okay.
I think it would be helpful for me today to do sort of a general overview. Next week I'll have some time to go through it in depth.
Okay,
And we
so,
talk about that historic.
Yeah, and then we can do that. So, if there's anything, let's do it this way. So if there's anything that others called out as pieces for us to talk about, because there's nothing other than sort of some aspects of those design standards that we really wanted to talk to you and get your feedback on. A lot of this you've seen already with some tweaks. So
I do have one addition that I think it would be helpful to include, and this is at the suggestion of Steve Lath.
okay.
In the R1 and R2 districts, we should have regulations for storage units. And he's recommending that it will be done by permit issued by the building inspector for a period not to exceed 6 months.
So we have language for that, can go,
Yeah,
Yeah.
like a pod, that's right.
Yeah,
we
but
have
there's
temporary structure pod language
Yep.
that can go right in certain use and
Right.
that can do that. So, perfect, we can plug that right in.
Thank you.
Good catch.
All right, so then what I'll do is just So one thing that we added to kind of give you, orient you to this a little bit, is for each of these district, set or grouping of districts, we've called out the design standards. So for example, for the building and site design of residential districts, we have some requirements regarding single and two-family dwellings and multifamily dwellings. A lot of this is more those pieces that are geared towards maintaining that character and walkability. Then for non-residential buildings, we also, yes.
Molly, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Who's gonna enforce this?
So these are all the pieces that would be looked at when an application comes to the planning board and historic preservation review board. So this is why, so one of the things that we got talking about a lot is that the standards, right, your review standards or considerations through site plan review seem generic. But the idea is that you're going site specific. We're looking at a property in the R3 district. So we're gonna go in here and we're gonna look and make, the developer's gonna take a look at these standards and make sure that their plans reflect that, and then the boards have the opportunity to utilize these to massage those plans and work with that.
Would it be appropriate to add language like, subject to the ultimate review and approval authority of the planning board and the HPRB, the following are suggested building and design, site design standards? So you're not getting into a conflict between, I'm only thinking of this from the HPRB perspective, you've got specific guidelines and authority granted to the HPRB. And is this meant to also guide them, or is it, this would be encouraged, but we know that the HPRB has the ultimate authority?
So it's more the former. It's more that these are the teeth. So these are the basics. We didn't put in here dictate anything about styling or anything like that. This is the basics of things that you're going to want to require of certain developments in districts. And then a lot of the standards in cases where it might be something that's more restrictive, the HPRB has the opportunity to waive that.
It seems to me, though, that you're sort of setting up a possible conflict where you've got the HPR given their authority and their portions of the code, and then the developer can point, well, we did this.
One of the exercises that we're going to have to do, because the HP board has standards now and design guidelines, we're going to have to make sure there aren't any conflicts between this and those standards. For example, in that diagram there,
Yeah.
we wouldn't call it a base because historic buildings don't have bases, they have foundations.
Okay.
So I'll probably be redrawing most of your diagrams.
Well, so that's one thing that we should figure out then, because I wanna understand how those design guidelines fit into the zoning code. They don't seem to be adopted as part of the zoning code, correct? Or they weren't
They were officially adopted, weren't they, Jeff?
They were adopted as guidelines.
as guidelines. So there's a lot of language in there that reads, and some of it actually says there's code requirements as part of that. So
So
One thing-
there's a lot of this, right?
there's some parts of that document that are listed and say code requirements, but it's
Oh, it's
in,
possible they refer to code requirements.
no, it dictates them.
Mhm.
It's not, it doesn't reference any zoning code, it doesn't reference the
Like how to hang
certification.
shutters, right?
It's very specific requirements. So the one thing that we were thinking that maybe it makes more sense, if that document has been the thing that has been most useful and successful for the HPRB to use, then why don't we incorporate that where it makes sense? I mean, we're not gonna keep the history of the village in the zoning code, but where it makes sense, take those requirements out of that document, or at least copy them out of that document and put them in here.
I think
and
that
reference
does
them.
make sense, especially because in there's special requirements for the post-war residential areas that I know have been heavily used by the HPB.
Okay.
There's a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then what I want you to do, please, is disregard the building and site design sections of the districts.
Okay,
Because those are where a lot of that language is.
okay.
And then we can pull that in.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of diagrams in there as well that may make sense to be pulled in
So
here. too.
where are they gonna go ultimately? Where's this flavor gonna go?
So what we'll have, since that's sort of established as that document that's adopted as guidelines, supportive guidelines, we will reference those as part of the building and site design standards. And then the things that are listed in that currently, that are the shalls, the you've gotta do this, we'll keep those in this document as well.
In this step?
In the code, yep,
Okay.
so that they have the full force of the code behind them.
That makes a
Shouldn't
lot
we-
of sense.
Shouldn't we move those into the HPRB code now?
This
Yeah.
is the HPRB code. The whole thing, the zoning code has the HPRB code in it.
Right. But I'm thinking that because the HPRB code is approved by SHPO, that we ought to have that in one discrete area so that it's always readily reviewable by SHPO. It's in one spot. So that this looks like this has general applicability across the entire zoning code, whereas the HPRB is a discrete part of that code with its own province from SHPO.
True, which we've established as under the code, but the thing that trips this up is that the entire village is the purview of the HPRB. And so the way that we've structured the review procedures is that anything that would require HPRB approval doesn't get any final answer until it gets to the HPRB.
Right.
Yes.
This might not be the place to insert it, but Maria said to me the other day, she noticed this, and she said, under certificates of appropriateness, the final approval should come from HPB, not contingent. It says here.
No, the planning board's decision on the site plan.
And she said it should not be contingent. She said that they cannot take final action until HPB makes their determination. And the way it's written currently, it says, upon the subsequent issuance. And so she said, no, you cannot take final action until that takes place.
So the HPRB can't take action until
They
the
must.
site plan's been done.
No, they cannot. She said that this is what needs to be changed. Certificate modification shall be contingent upon the subsequent issuance of a certificate of appropriateness. And she said, no, there should be no contingencies. They cannot make final action until they get the C of A. The PZBA cannot take final action. I'm pretty sure that's the way.
Okay, I understand what she's saying.
Okay. She said that it's bad chronologically. There should be no contingencies. That should change. So that the HPB is the final
Right.
action.
So the HPRB, whatever we're gonna call them.
Yeah, I know, we
Historic
keep tripping
Preservation
over that.
Board.
It's HPRB, that's what you adopted.
No, it's HPB.
Thank
We
you.
decided-
It's HPRB.
We decided to change it to
Oh, alright, well then I need to change it in here, because that's not what you adopted. Alright,
So, the HPB can't act until the planning board takes final action.
no, I think she's saying the
Saying
reverse.
the reverse of that.
That shouldn't be the way it should be.
That's what our understanding of that is, because what you don't, the reason why we structured this way, ideally, perfect world, where we came from originally, is that the planning, PZBA takes everything and just says, here you go, HPB, we recommend you do this or that, and then HPB makes the final decision on everything. But we discussed leaving site plan with planning board, so what we don't wanna do is we don't want a situation where the planning board said, okay, right? She's saying go to the C of A first,
Yes.
but then you're gonna have to go back to the planning board.
Why don't we ask them?
Usually,
Because
the planning board will approve based on contingent on whatever.
I have always heard that
Yeah.
the HPB goes last
Yep.
because they have the most discretion
that's right.
Yes.
or the highest amount of detail. So,
Right,
and if the planning board approves it,
Mhm.
and then the HPB is not hindered by that approval, they can still deny anything, and it might have to go back to site plan for another
Right.
site plan for something that can be approved by the HPB.
And hopefully, if there's a secret process, the two boards will communicate with each other. using the
Yes,
secret
that's,
process.
so that's the intent, is at the very beginning, both boards are looking at everything at the very beginning. And the HPB has the opportunity in the beginning to say, these are things we care about, these are the comments we have, right, on this application, as it's going before you. And then the planning board does their due diligence with respect to the site and the application and all that. And they say, all right, we approve this for you applicant, contingent on the fact that you have to get approval of a C of A from HPB.
Yeah,
Right.
Yes,
That's how I do it.
Yeah, that's what I thought we all were on that.
Mhm.
We could talk to her to see maybe see what her hang up is on that,
Yeah.
but
I'm gonna see her Saturday and I will talk it through.
okay.
So
Yeah.
getting back to whatever piece of the design guidelines you're gonna stick in as binding requirements in the code, it seems to me that since it's an HPV deal, it ought to be in the HPV code.
Well, they're not necessarily, and this is the reason why I don't like that we've divided final say on site plan with planning board and final say on elevations and design with HPB, because you can't really divide them, right? I mean, to look at the site plan, you need to have an understanding of massing and how the transparency of the building and placement, and the same thing for the HPB. They're going to care about where the building is and how it's oriented and those things as well. So the standards collectively, I understand what you're saying, is it's not necessarily the purviews diverge, but the standards themselves are related.
No,
Is
I
that
don't see it.
clear?
I just don't see it that way, but that's how I look at it. I look at two specifically different jobs between the two boards. And then if you're looking at how, I guess I understand why you're doing the standards, because then the site plan, or the planning board can look at building in and outs, but presumably they could ask the HPD that question in the consulting or the secret process.
Yeah, ideally, from an application, the flow of an application and the flow of information perspective, I think what's going to make the most sense, and is going to make it easier for the review boards in terms of what information they have when they're reviewing it, and for the applicant in terms of what's being asked of them at what point in the process, to come forward and to have them still, you know, they're submitting their site plan and their elevations and design to planning board. And planning board essentially knows their purview is the site and all of those things, and that the rest of the details get fleshed out with the HPV. But it's a complete package that then goes on to the HPV. Essentially, the HPV is like the final. All right, planning board. You said this about the site plan. Okay, yep, we got it. Agree. You know, these are the recommendations, and this is the condition of the design of the buildings, and yada yada. These are the changes we want, and these are the changes we don't want. And then their approval essentially is on the entirety of the whole thing, which is why I personally think that the planning board being a recommendation rather than a final action, a contingent final action, would make more sense.
But we are separating, we're putting the HPV last,
Yes.
so it would make sense to separate the duties and requirements in code. So that you're telling the HPIB what their guidelines are and what they're supposed to do. So what used to be in the guidelines is mandatory, which I'm not sure really would be mandatory, if push came to shove, is now gonna go somewhere in the code, and my point is that it's the HPV's job, it ought to go in the HPV code.
If they're in the code, they're standards rather than guidelines.
Right.
Okay.
And that's, I mean, anything that's going to go through this review process and will be looked at in terms of standards is going to be HPRB standards ultimately. And so that's why the whole of this code, although it's the zoning code, I mean, for all intents and purposes, your HPB is your final action board. That's the, you know, the end of the line decision.
I think Jeff's point, and, you know, there have been times when there's been confusion between the two boards over who has jurisdiction.
Mhm.
And we have to be careful that we don't, you know, write this in a way that it isn't very clear who's authorized to look at what. And if we duplicate it, then, you know, human nature is we're gonna.
That's right, they won't be able to keep themselves from commenting
Correct.
on the facades.
So
I think what I wrote down was that she said PBZA cannot take final action until HPRB approves. There are no contingency approvals because it's confusing to an applicant if they think, you know, what do you mean contingent as an approval? You approved me. Why do I have to go back?
well,
They just cannot have final approval until they get the C of A from
I think
So it's a
HPRB.
matter of
Well, is it
language?
possible that she's talking about the project not getting final approval until the HPRB does its job? Because that makes more sense, but somebody's gotta finish their work, so the planning board's gotta finish their work, and then the HPB steps up and does the rest of its job. That's
Bob, you're gonna talk to Maria on Saturday.
I will.
Yeah.
So in terms of procedures, chicken and egg, let's table that.
Right.
On time for a minute.
Right.
In terms of the design stuff, what's intriguing, and I'm processing this is interesting. I mean, Jeff, are you saying, is it cleaner, one version?
building and site.
Bingo. That's
What?
exactly right. Stop stealing my ideas. That's what I was just gonna say.
Building standards and site design standards.
Site goes in the zoning code, building goes in.
Right, exactly.
So
Exactly.
now that where there's gonna be crossover there is when we talk about building massing,
Mass
orientation,
Oh.
right? And massing to some extent, I mean, you need to know that as part of site plan. So that piece, will be where that overlap is, but that's where that initial recommendation or
Consultation.
comment is gonna need to be important, you know, that's gonna have to come in the beginning of the process.
In
Plus,
that,
we-
in that
let me-
breakout,
Excuse me, Dan, if I could just, because I want to capture on Molly's comment there. The key thing, Molly, is that we don't want to do anything that will impair the HPB's ability to regulate bulk, mass, and scale.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay,
Sorry, Dan.
so
no
it's,
problem.
it's gonna be, I just wanna, so. Okay,
I got an idea too, but hold on, I
Okay.
can't go.
No,
Yeah.
but I'm gonna take it's related, but it's like,
Oh, let us
it's
finish
not
that.
mass and scale.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
hold
Okay, so height, mass, and scale, design, height, mass, scale.
Mhm.
That's what we're talking about with,
And bulk.
and orientation
Orientation too, yeah.
on.
with HPC.
So here's my thought. If you want the HPV to have jurisdiction or something, put it in their code. I don't know that it necessarily is a big deal if you put some of that massing and so forth in the zoning code so that other boards can think about it. But if you're gonna do that, I would say that there ought to be a referral. You could put right in that area, a
Right.
referral to the APRB for input on those issues, so that we're not,
So that we don't have muddy waters.
So then the only down, and it sounds like this might be a cleaner way, we'll chew on it, but the downside, and it's not a huge downside, because clarity is what's important, and as long as each board has the proper guidance, it'll make these a little, generic's the wrong word, but not quite as tailored to each district, because so much of Pittsford is architectural. Just so you know, just these will watered down's the wrong way, but you know, you see where I'm going. It's like Pittsburgh is so tied to architecture, and this will, less of that will end up.
Well,
here.
I think under this, we could still have it in there, but it would, the planning board would, you know, as Jeff suggested, have a referral to get input from the HPV.
So,
Right, but Jeff also said not to have it in two places, so architectural stuff would end up in their code.
I guess I'm
But
more
hold
concerned.
on, so the one thing that needs to be clear is their code is not separate.
Right.
This is all in one thing.
Well, it is, because you're giving the HPB specific work to do with specific guidelines in their code. And I getting back to CLG status, in order for that to be work, it's gotta be approved by SHPO. So whatever you want the HPRB to do has got to be in the HPRB section of the code.
The HPRB section of the code is one section that establishes the board, and the one section that outlines the procedures for the certificate of appropriateness.
Right.
So essentially what I'm saying is in the same way that we had the admin, essentially the establishment part that deals with the establishment of the Planning Zoning Board of Appeals, the HPV, whatever, the village board's role with zoning is in part 1. All of your review procedures, including C of A, site plan, special permit, are in part 3. In part 2, we need to find a way to do the same thing, that we're pulling out, this is planning board level information, and this is HPRB level information. So they're packaged to, essentially it's like a horizontal package, right, of each thing. So you have your historic preservation related stuff as it goes through part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. Here's all of the information that relates to what is the historic preservation aspect of that. And then the zoning code, or the overarching pieces of the zoning code, essentially are the same thing. They go across the board. So we need to find a way to differentiate and separate, right? So like off-street parking and driveways is not going to be something that HPRB needs to look at. So if we can separate these standards, maybe it's by the review process.
Yeah.
It's site plan and special permit standards, considerations, and then it's the stuff for C of A. And we can make it explicit that, which board is looking at what. And so that way when we outline the things that are more like the building and design standards that are more HPB related, we could at least include language that says, the planning board may refer to these for guidance. It's not necessarily their job to enforce that, but it's in there as something.
But if we have language for a formal referral process,
Mhm.
that should help
Who goes
clarify.
first?
Because say there's a new development project somewhere,
Mhm.
and with a site plan and building designs,
Mhm.
of course, we want the planning board to invite the HPV to look at the bulk mass scale architectural detail of the buildings and see if it fits whatever.
Right, and that's built into the review process already. The referrals are built into that process. So I'm thinking what you're saying, Jeff. We need to make that clarification as to what's the purview of the planning board and what's the purview of the HPV, and we can do that as it relates to these districts, because as John said, this is the reason why this part has been so difficult, is that each district is different, has its own standards, and then each board, when they're looking at something in that district, is looking at different stuff. So,
Why do you need, I know this is probably reinventing the wheel, but why do you need guidelines and standards for each district?
Because there's Shane Place, for example, has very distinctive types of buildings that are there that are very different than State Street or Boughton Avenue.
And the same
Well,
with your off-street parking requirements for your downtown might be different than they are in Shane Place.
I get that, but it's the HPP's job to match up architecture by district. So
Right.
that when you plop something down at Shane Place or Northfield Commons,
It fits the context.
the HPP's job to start with is to make it fit the context. So that would be my response to why you need guidelines.
But it's more explicit, Jeff. It's more explicit to divide it up, and you can be more detailed.
Well, and I think what it would be helpful, so again, just, taking the role of the applicant for a second, and also the boards. When the application comes in first, if I know looking through the zoning code, when I'm going through the site plan process, that these are the standards that apply to the site, and I also can see that the follow-on of that, or these are my building standards, right, that apply from a design standpoint for the district that I'm in, then I can shape the whole of my application to meet the expectations of the boards, ideally, right, when you come through. And then that conversation comes around the nuance and the oddities and the things that, zoning codes can't plan for, they can't fix. Or address directly. So
So I think when you say it that way, you're setting up a fundamental ability to attack whatever the HPB may decide to do in its purview, because the applicant is going to be free to say, well, you told me these are the design standards and guidelines, and I've met them. Now the HPB is telling me to do something different.
but they would have different, the standards would be the standards that the HPB is reviewing. I mean, we would use the design guidelines that you already have. We would refer to those for the things that are the flexible aspects, but there are aspects of that are hard and fast shell rules, and that's what we'll pull into the code.
So yeah, they better match up to it, so there's no room for.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I mean, like I said, disregard these design standards,
Yeah, it'd be totally different.
because we're gonna shape that entirely around and rely on that document, and we'll pull out the stuff that's regulatory, and that'll be a part of the code, and then the stuff that's guidance, we'll just make sure that's referenced.
And the only thing I would say to that is, when that was written, there isn't a lot in there about Shane Place.
Yeah,
So we might want to think about adding some stuff that will help with Shane Place.
that sounds like a good podcast.
Okay. Okay.
Where in the distinction between buildings and sites, where does landscaping fall? Under the building or the site?
Site.
Okay.
Yeah, and pretty much everything, so essentially what we're, as far as dictatorial as the zoning code would ever get with regard to HPV, is anything that's in those design standards currently that's talking about the facades, the physical design, and will have the language that supports their purview in terms of height, scale, orientation, all that jazz. But yeah.
You also mentioned earlier, I have to get going, you mentioned earlier we have to schedule something. You said we have to schedule.
our next meeting, so that we can go
Could we
through the second,
pause to do that for a
yeah, the
minute?
second iteration of this.
So you want comments on this section specifically?
Yeah, so if there's any comments that you have in this section disregarding design standards, building and site design standards, that would be helpful.
Did you just say if there were any more comments on any other section besides design standards? Or did,
No, I'm volume 2,
Except the portion dealing with design standards.
except the portion dealing with design standards. We're still gonna talk about it. I'm just saying, if you're gonna continue reviewing and send more stuff. Yeah.
if you're gonna keep changing stuff,
Yeah, no, the thing that will significantly change is the building and site design standards under each district article,
Okay,
okay? So that's
so
the
we're gonna
piece,
be working on that, that's what we're working on.
that's what John and I are gonna try to Frankenstein together with the direction of the design standards.
Okay.
That the HPP
Like
has.
seeker one also, because it's, we also want to,
So that's a part of part 3, we can talk about that later, that's not part of this.
okay, so we're not talking about that.
No, nope.
Where
We're
would
still
that
in-
come in here?
We're still in part 2. We can talk about it when we're done, with
Okay,
this, yep.
okay.
So, in terms of a meeting date, the 20th or the 22nd, I think work,
The 22nd, we have a trustee meeting,
okay.
hearing, in off-site.
Correct.
The Wednesday?
The 22nd.
I can't do the 20th.
I thought there was something going on in the 20th.
Let's bring up the village map. I mean, calendar.
So the 20, what day of the week is the 22nd? I don't
Monday,
know.
there's a PCBA
Wednesday.
meeting.
Wednesday is the
Okay.
22nd.
So what was the other day that was available?
The 20th, which is a
What day
Monday.
of the week is that?
Monday.
Monday.
The plan,
Unless we could meet downstairs.
What day are we talking about?
Monday.
what time were we meeting, what time are we talking about meeting?
Well, if we met at 5:30 and we're done by 7, it would be a problem.
Yeah, that would work better for me to be done at 7.
If we're done by 7, yes.
Okay,
I don't have a
Monday,
commitment that
the
way.
21st,
Monday the
20th.
20th, sorry, 5:30 to 7.
Hard stop at 7.
Because of the PBCA.
And we can't set the room up this way.
Say again?
And we can't set the room up this way.
That's, we can
That
do
was Joanne's doing.
What?
It's Joanne's doing.
Didn't say we were meeting at 5
I
or
was like,
5.
Joanne, let's move it. She said,
You
no.
work back in 30 seconds?
Did you do it already?
Nope.
Oh,
5 o'clock, right? 5 to 7?
5 to 7 or 5:30 to 7?
5 works with me.
5 is fine with me.
5? Good thing you said that, because I would have been here at 5:30.
Okay.
So what time is it?
5 o'clock.
5,
20th, Monday the 20th.
May 20th, 5 to 7. Hard stop. Full stop.
Full stop.
Okay.
Do we need to let, you'll let Dorothy know. Okay. I have to go. Thank you, I'm sorry.
Okay. So the other thing I want to walk through, or at least touch on as part of this, is the approach to we have essentially, I believe it's 3 design standard sections under each district article. We've got building and site design standards, which we just ripped apart. That's
So
fine.
you got F.
Okay,
Thank you.
28.
Yeah, you're page 9 right now.
So, Molly, just so I'm making sure I'm killing this horse that's already laying dead,
That's fine.
I really think you could leave the design standards the way they are if you said something like, subject to the authority of the HPV with regard to final approval or something like that is set forth in whatever chapter they're in.
Yeah, no, that language I think will fit
That
in
way we don't
there.
have to mess around with it.
But I do think we want to make sure the design, because the design standards language is going to be more specific.
So then you could just, if you wanted to leave the design standards, you did that, and you could even add the planning board to that.
Yeah.
Castle, then you could give the HPV the specific regulatory power you wanted from the current guidelines, just in the HPV code, and then you'd be done.
Okay, yeah.
Question, Molly, on
Yes.
off-street parking and driveways,
Yes.
should we have a setback from a property line to ensure that the no driveway drains on someone else's property?
The setbacks are listed in the table under the district.
Okay, okay.
Yep, so that would apply there. The one thing I wasn't sure of, do you do driveway permits?
We should.
But do you?
Do driveway, new driveway cuts are permitted,
For new
right?
driveways,
Yeah.
it requires permission from the village board for a curb cut. And it should also require site plan approval because we want to ensure that, you know, someone isn't paving their back lawn to drain into someone else's basement.
Yeah, so that is a I know driveways are listed under the site plan requirements that we have in the draft, so that'll work. I just wanna make sure if you did have a specific driveway permit, that we reference it.
That's
So
right.
what do you mean, Mom?
I was asked about
Permit
that.
for what?
So, if someone wants
Yeah,
to
good.
extend their driveway or, change its
It's gotta be
orientation.
site.
It
Yeah.
requires site plan
Yeah,
review.
so that's,
So that's the permit.
Yep.
She did, I will say she, and you know to whom I'm
I
referring,
don't know, do they do?
did not feel that the village board needed to to approve curb cuts. She felt it should be a permit that is issued by the building department, and the person wanting the curb cut, like other municipalities, would go to the, if it was on a state road or so on and so forth, they would have to, because if there were pipes or anything underneath, they have to get the permit from that entity.
Well, and that's exactly why I think it should come to the village board.
Okay.
Because, say, on Downton Avenue where that big oak tree is at the end of the street, what if someone wanted to put a driveway and just take that oak tree out?
there's also, the benefit of doing that with the village board is that you have that referral requirement to send it to the DOTs. So that would be an aspect of
She
that.
said it's a curb cut permit because of the engineering, something is an ministerial action, and that it should be taken care of, but between the applicant and the building department, and they should be referred to the proper entity and provide to the village their permit.
Well,
I don't think it's
my
necessary.
concern is driveways impact village infrastructure.
I
Or-
mentioned about the drainage and so forth.
Well, what if, say someone wanted to put a driveway where a harp light was,
Right,
and they were gonna take out the harp light for the driveway? Technically, the planning board doesn't have jurisdiction over village streets, only the village board does.
okay.
So if it's a tree or a street light or a bench or anything else, a clock,
Okay,
that should come to us.
okay, I'm good with that.
I
As
don't
much
see,
as
I
anything else.
don't think it's necessary either.
No,
That's-
Okay.
Yeah, I disagree.
perfect.
I agree with you.
Technically our official mechanism. Excuse me.
Alright.
So, there's 3 different sections of standards, within each district. Building site design, we're done for that. Off-street parking, driveways is only, included in the residential section, we don't really need to address that outside of that. That's more just access drives later on. And then the third is the landscaping and screening. The landscaping and screening is probably the most consistent one throughout all the districts, because it's mostly dealing with buffer sizes and things, and required plants.
Where'd the 15 feet come from?
What,
That
50 feet?
seems, there's 15 feet in there, it seems awfully wide to me. I don't know.
12 feet and 18 feet.
No, some of the buffering.
I think it's the
Oh.
back, the rear lot line.
15, you know, that's a lot of footage. to
Rear
use
rear
up.
yard buffering.
15 seems like a lot.
What page are you gonna do?
This is page 11, right?
It's pretty consistent though,
Side yard buffer.
through all the buffering sections.
I would rather have more width, because we don't want a scenario like 75 Monroe, where they put in trees, but they put them in a ridiculously little area where they're never gonna grow.
Sure. Is this something, and I had a thought about this. Is this something where we want to, say, a planting screen, should be provided along the rear lot line, of at least, 10 or 15 feet in depth and attaining a height of not less than 8 feet, and then have the opportunity that the planning board can modify that if necessary.
As long as there's a performance standard, the key thing is that it's not optional.
Okay.
And that year-round, the resident being protected is guaranteed a substantial visual buffer.
Okay. The other piece is, these parking space requirements. Now, with residential, that's pretty straightforward, and obviously mostly dealt with, the driveways for single-family homes. The section that I want to bring up is on page starting on page 25. So off-street parking and loading, we have some general standards, which, you know, making sure that you're not putting parking in the front yard. Planning board can waive spaces, or they can require more additional spaces than what this says if it's deemed necessary, lighting, yada yada. Then we have our minimum standard for parking. And the one thing that we included and that we had talked about was on page 26, the alternative parking arrangements. And this allows for, as written, it allows for counting on-street parking and public spaces to satisfy up to 20% of the requirements for that use, as long as those spaces aren't more than 1,000 feet away. And then there's provisions for joint and shared parking, which joint parking is, we're two uses and we're gonna use the same lot, but we each have to have the required number for our own operating uses. Whereas shared is, we're two uses, we have a shared parking lot, my peak hours are 9 to 4 and my peak hours are 4 to 9 p.m., so we get to use the same number of spots.
I think if you're gonna do shared parking, then you also need a contract.
Yes, that's in here.
Okay.
Yep,
it's in
so
there, okay.
as part of shared parking or joint parking, you have to have an agreement documenting the use, and it's reflected in a deed, lease, contract, easement, or other appropriate legal document, and you have to have a maintenance agreement, and then shared access agreements.
And do we need, Jeff, and this is a question, do we need a statement that, you know, if the contract, it has a time period, and it's not renewed, then the use, the permit is gone? How do we say that?
Well, right now, I think our code anticipates in perpetuity,
Yeah.
so that can't be our contract unless it's in perpetuity.
Well, somehow we need to protect ourselves.
No,
because-
that's the answer. I mean, it's either, but we'll never know. If we give the permit, it's a 5-year contract, and it's on the 6th year, the contract is revoked or not renewed, we'll never know as a village. So at the outset, we gotta do the in perpetuity at the outset. Let me say that again. But we do that now with an easement or a long-term lease.
Mhm. Well, whatever the solution is, I think we need to put it in here, otherwise we're setting ourselves up
Yeah,
for
well,
failure. The other question I have, Molly, is I want to go back to the, just thinking this through on the 20% use of on-street parking.
Yes.
I mean, there are many areas of the village now where the on-street parking is completely at capacity. So I would worry if we're going to double dip and create a crisis if we are counting parking spaces that aren't there.
So that's possible, and if you'd prefer, like, downtown, if the on-street parking spaces, for example, in downtown obviously are well used, we can make the exception that those in that district wouldn't apply. But the one thing about the on-street, parking provision is that it's really just meant to say, we're gonna lessen your burden of parking spaces because we know you have access to those. But if your response is, or your thought is that, you know what, we pretty well tapped out our public spaces, then we can just remove that provision, that's fine. You don't have to provide
I think we've got to think that one through carefully,
the, okay,
because we want to provide flexibility, I like that, but on the other hand, you know, I've been in the library lot the last few days, and it's full.
Oh, yeah, you can park it during the day. Weekends you can park a little bit.
But you can find a place to park.
You know, the other
You can.
point, Bob,
You can.
Alternate parking plan if you-
the other
Well,
point
that's-
is,
In the weekend?
we don't,
I mean, you have to.
we don't allow, we don't allow on-street
Yeah,
parking
no, not
during
Oh, I just called it
so many
alternative.
months during the year. And that should be taken into account when we're considering residential parking. That's what we're talking about, aren't we?
well, we're talking about business districts.
We're talking about business district parking. And I think there are a few places where we can add more on-street parking that doesn't exist now, it should be part of traffic calming. So I need to read this
Yeah.
thoroughly, and then let's just think about it.
Okay, and
Okay.
yeah, and like I
Yeah.
said, I mean, that provision, we can break that up, and it can be, you know what, this area is tight, so that doesn't make sense here, we're gonna strike that, or this district's got a little flexibility, why don't we keep that? The one last thing I do want to, highlight, yeah,
Just real quick, in D, if you take out contract, I think we solved your problem,
okay,
Bob's problem. That way whoever's doing the thing can monitor the length of the lease and the easement and all that stuff.
okay. The last piece is the existing, use exemption. And this one, we kind of talked about a little bit in the last, meeting, I'm interested to see what your reaction is. So basically, any lawfully existing use that's within that district, is required to provide, no lawfully existing use within that district shall be required to provide parking in excess of what is currently provided. So basically, take a snapshot of what's happening, right, in downtown, and all of the uses that have their associated parking. Right now, we're giving you a full blanket grant of, that's conforming. You've got your spaces, right? But if you're gonna expand your use, so I'm on Main Street, I wanna expand my restaurant by 500 square feet. Now, additional parking requirements kick in. So count my existing, but my new space requires me to have 3 more, I have to provide 3 more.
I like that,
Okay.
yeah, good approach.
Yeah.
Can you explain the bicycle number 1 under E? I think we're on the same page.
What
still.
page are you on?
27.
27.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, this is not.
Let's see, whoops, wait, no, I lost it. Bicycle parking shall be provided at a rate, I get that part, the 10%, bless you, of vehicle parking requirements. However, in no case shall a single use provide less than 2 spaces, meaning nor a use be required to provide more than 10 spaces. What's a use? What's a single use? Are you
So-
talking about the vehicle? Can you just explain what that
Yeah,
means?
so the way that the parking requirements are defined is by use,
Okay.
right? So it's just saying that, say, my use requirements for parking spaces is only 3, and 10% is the minimum, I have to at least provide 2,
Okay.
even though my parking requirement is a low number, right?
Okay.
But if I have a really large use and I'm required to provide 50 spaces, or that's a bad number, 500, I don't know, maybe 100 spaces, I don't have to provide 50 bike spaces. I would only be required to provide 10.
Okay, gotcha, thank you.
I have another suggestion, on the permeable paving on
Yes,
page 27.
yes.
I would also add, it's not good grammar, I think, to start a sentence with because. But my comment is, the other factor here is that much of the village stormwater system is near or at capacity.
Okay.
So permeable paving would help lessen additional taxing of our
Yeah,
overtax system.
so one of the ways that we did this is from your existing, code, but I like it because it's an important consideration to keep, so we'll just rework the wording. The second piece about impervious surfaces, we put it in there that the planning board, can consider or require it to be permeable pavement.
Yep.
So it's sort of that case by case basis, on whether or not, I mean, if it's a heavy lift, maybe that doesn't make sense, but
But I think, Justin, I know what Justin's gonna say. We need standards, so I think,
Well,
consider the location of hydric soils, which are widespread, clay and hydric soils,
can I
widespread.
say a few seconds? How onerous would it be if we said new parking spaces are going to be pervious? So that the initial requirement is on page 25, and it says, all spaces shall be hard surfaced with blah, 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 blah. So the pervious is a deviation from the hard, but if you said new spaces, newly created parking spaces shall be.
or repave, are you gonna go so far as to say then repave spaces as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's a question.
Well, I think you gotta be careful there, because.
So we could provide planning board could waive that, right, if it were a cost burden or something?
Normally, milling and paving is not gonna require site plan review. So it would be difficult to require them. And to put in permeable paving, you've gotta take up the base.
So it would be for new construction.
So just
we're back to
new.
standards for the planning board, I think.
Okay, so standards for the planning board. So we're not gonna require permeable pavement of new,
No, I think it's a good idea.
required of new,
New.
just not
Yeah.
changing, okay.
I think there may be cases where it may not be practical, but I think we should allow the planning board to require it if they want to.
Okay.
And 5 there,
Yes,
I think you could just delete wherever possible.
okay. Under the general screening standards?
Yeah.
Offering standards.
I think maybe you have this somewhere, and again, I'll find this when I do a detailed read, but is there verbiage in here that all landscaping installed as part of site plan approval must be maintained in that? And the other thing here, we've talked a lot about heritage trees. There's a handful of trees in the village that are over 150 years old, and perhaps those trees should require review by the planning board if someone's planning to cut them down.
So you need a definition for heritage trees.
How do the other board members think?
You have I saw online, I didn't look at it, there's a tree inventory, would that include that?
Well, the tree inventory is for our street trees.
Gotcha, okay.
But for example, behind the Gothic Revival House on Monroe Avenue, there's a magnificent, probably one of the biggest trees in the village, walnut tree. That it's probably, 80 feet across in its canopy. It's enormous. And that would,
So,
and there's a few other trees like
Yeah.
that scattered around.
I think for something like that, Bob, what would make more sense is if you, as another sort of maybe a follow-on action or something, went through, did the identification of those trees, and there was a local law that essentially defines what a heritage, tree removal permit or something. That way, we're not, because you're gonna have to go through and define those, and I'm not quite sure that the zoning code would promote it enough to become it, that's
Okay.
a way.
So you think we need a tree ordinance?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
essentially.
Okay,
You got heritage tree ordinance.
Yeah,
okay.
oh yeah, good, yeah, write that down.
I got it.
You're so smart.
Once in a while.
And then as part of landscaping screening, the other thing we added, this was, something that Peggy had asked for was public and open space requirements. And this is also something that the comp plan team has talked about a lot, is making sure that when we're reviewing new development in the future, we have the opportunity to require public or open common space, whether it's green space or a civic space of some kind. So this provides a little bit of context for that. Right now we have it of, it has to be at least 30% of the gross acreage. And we made sure to make that designation that it's comprised of contiguous lands unless otherwise approved by the planning board.
Will this fit better in subdivision?
As part of this, would be a site plan.
Be a site plan issue, Jeff.
Yeah.
Not if you're gonna take dedication, that's more of a, when you're subdividing property, that's when you take that dedication.
Does it require dedication?
There's somewhere it uses the word take dedication of the,
The lands to be preserved may be dedicated in fee to the village or other such public agency, or may remain in private ownership. That's for maintenance purposes.
or otherwise, how are you gonna ensure the public use?
The village may require granting of an easement guaranteeing public's right of access and use if it remains private.
So I would think this is part of when you're subdividing property and putting a new development, right?
Right, but you may not have subdivision if it's just a.
That's true.
I mean, there is actually language like this in subdivision as well. There is an open space section of that.
So is this intending to deal with commercial site plan review?
Yeah.
What time is the, does anybody know what time we're starting the meeting with 75 Monroe on the 22nd?
I think it's 7 o'clock.
I think we said 7 o'clock, right? Alan Knopf has confirmed that date.
Yes, confirmed.
I just got a text from Dan Spitzer.
I mean, if there's another. I mean, we could probably just strike that first sentence and just have it be if it's public space that's intended to be remained for under private ownership that.
I'm just wondering where is the teeth coming from to do this?
As part of a site plan request, say, let's see, where would this make sense? Okay, so if you were to redevelop some of the property in downtown by the library, and you could have requests that there be an open space area provided as part of that redevelopment, that would be dedicated public space or green space.
That's assuming that the town comes before you in the first place for a permit?
Let's play this out because I want to, at the dairy, if you go to the dairy right now, the area that is bounded by the dairy, the cow barn in my parents' house, that is an acre. My parents' back lawn, which is enormous, that's another acre. That whole parcel is just under 6 acres, which is about the same size as the Wilmerite area. So I'm just, I want 30% of, what is 30% of 6 acres? 2 acres, right?
Right,
1 point something, right? That's a lot of open space.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we don't have to dictate a number. It can be,
The whole point of that, it was contiguous, because
Yes.
every time we see a development plan for development, they're taking these little pieces of green that they've got scattered throughout, adding them all.
Yeah, I think we need to have, this is one of those places, again, I'll be just in. We need performance standards because if you say no standard, the developers are gonna give you a 7-foot by 7-foot
Right.
square and say, here's your open space. So I think we need to think through exactly what we want, what it's gonna be used for, and as Lily said, it has to be contiguous and usable and visible. And it has to fit the district too.
Mhm.
Because for example, on South Main Street, if the building burned down, I don't think we'd want to create open space.
Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. We can do that. So not have just one standard, we can set up some, essentially there are qualifiers that would decide what the size is and if it were even required. Okay. No. Okay, one of the last things that is significantly different that I wanted to point out is that we do have included and maintained that local waterfront overlay, and it wasn't explicit, or it's not explicit in the current code how that applies to the zoning map in the sense that how the boundaries matched up. So we took what was interpreted in the GIS layer as the LWRP boundary and have essentially just used that as the indicator for what the local waterfront overlay, what that applies to. And more or less all this is saying is that you can do whatever you're allowed to do in the underlying district, you just have to go through chapter 121, the local waterfront.
I have a quick question for you, Molly.
Yes.
I noticed in the LWRP boundary that the
Yes.
whole northwest quadrant is not in there, which is bizarre.
Is that not, so this is the GIS that we got?
We better double check that because that doesn't make sense to me that this wouldn't be in there. Maybe it's correct. If it is correct, I think we should consider changing it.
The northwest quadrant? It's in
Well, I would think all of this would be part of the LWRP.
It is.
It is.
It
It's
is.
got the dots
Oh,
on
you
it.
mean the
Oh, okay. I was looking at the,
Yeah, yeah. Everything with the dots.
Yeah, it's
You're
not,
not talking about up here. You're talking about the green.
yeah, I'm talking about the grid.
Mara, what section are we in right now?
this is page 42, and this is under the special purpose and special purpose district section.
So there's not gonna be anything like 210.23.4.5 for the OS district? There won't be anything like that for the,
Nope.
okay,
Nope.
so that answers it.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, that one's easy. It's more or less, this is just the place in the zoning code that we're triggering the fact that you gotta go to chapter 121. And it's hopefully having it on the map as someone looking at it can say, all right, I am in that boundary.
Yeah.
I gotta do something about that. Okay, so in the interest of time, I do want to talk about three things, because I know you wanted to talk about seeker in part one, and we want to talk about sketch plan. Well, I think that's what you would email me about. And the other piece, sort of question that's been thrown around is whether or not the village should consider utilizing an incentive zoning district or incentive zoning provision.
No.
Agreed.
We agree. Okay.
But we do want to give it the due diligence of the conversation and what the benefits and cons are. If you don't know what incentive zoning is, more or less, the idea is that you are saying you are open and flexible to certain aspects of a development if you are getting certain identified things in return. And that it works well in situations like something like open space where a community, if there's a larger, say you were going to allow the Northwest Quadrant to be developed. If a developer came in and they want to do a residential development and you are requiring that you want to have a significant amount of open space reserved, they could potentially get a benefit that you've identified as increased density or something to have on the trade-off that you get. They also provide you that open space. The problem with that is that with incentive zoning, in order to function properly, you have to have very explicit statements and standards of what it is you are willing to give up and what it is that you are requiring. So while it sounds super good because it's the conversation and the flow of tit for, we'll give you this if you give us that. To have it function properly, it has to be very explicit, and that's not necessarily what you're looking for when you're reacting to an application. The other piece of that is that it is something that can be heavily abused, and it doesn't work out well. Sometimes not for the municipality, and sometimes not for the developer, and that ends up in obviously some issues with litigation.
And the reality, Pittsburgh is such a physically small place. I could see a legal nexus between almost any improvements in any project.
Yeah.
I know I'm stretching that, Jeff, but you know what I mean? You could say, like 75 Monroe, you wanted the median and some of the improvements on Monroe Ave. You didn't need incentive zoning to accomplish that.
Yep.
Whereas in a town where geographically large, you might want improvements 4 miles or 5 miles away to the south that really aren't tangential to the project.
Right.
We're still not fans even in town settings, but I think it makes a little more sense in towns, but not.
And it makes more sense in places that do have larger areas that are to be developed, and where you are. I'll be very honest, and where you're a community that's ready to state these are the things that we're going to give up as part of this process, right? Increased density or higher structures, more building coverage, things like that. And those don't necessarily seem to me like things that Pittsburgh wants to have that conversation about at all, being a question mark in the beginning.
Right.
I think what you want and what can be beneficial, like John said, the way that we have the standards written currently for any redevelopment that comes in, you have that nexus, you have the standards to say we need X improvement to enhance the walkability, the character, to preserve all these things. We have the open space provisions as part of the code, historic design standards, all of that. So what sounds like would be most effective and most beneficial to you is like what your performance overlay district is, but have it essentially be plan development. So you're looking for, we will have flexibility in terms of what we're going to allow, right? But you're not setting the parameters at the start. So that gives you the opportunity, you are setting your intention, your values, and your objectives at the start with plan development. And then you're utilizing essentially the site plan review process and the rezoning process to massage that potential development into what it is you want it to look like. And that's based off of, again, the standards of your code, but you get to be the deciders of what is flexible and what isn't as part of plan development. Did I do justice enough to add to both of those? I don't know.
Does the town use incentive zoning? Just curious.
They do, and it's been a disaster.
Okay, just if I criticize that part of Bill, I want to know what. That's all I'm going to raise my hands.
Oh, there's other communities we know that use it too, and they don't use it very well. So.
Brighton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Poster child for misuse.
Yeah. One other question. This has become a big issue in terms of sustainability certain trees like, about the death of bees and frogs. Okay. Bradford pears and Cleveland pears in particular kill bees because they don't have nectar, and bees exhaust themselves going from blossom to blossom. They're beautiful in the spring.
That sounds so sad.
We plant them, but the bees just die because they exhaust themselves with no nectar. So somewhere in our site plan code, we should ban the planting of Bradford pears and Cleveland pears. And I don't want to say non-indigenous species because some trees like Zelkova are perfectly acceptable, or Norway spruce. But Bradford pears, we need to spell out, plants such as Bradford pears and Cleveland pears that are non-native and are harmful to native fauna are banned.
So, we can add that, and the one thing I will say, we do have 2 things under the landscape requirements currently that require that plant and landscape materials be compatible with the soil conditions and the regional climate. Native species are encouraged, not required. We can add the prohibition of Bradford and Cleveland pears, and then we also reference
And all plants classified as invasive
Invasive
by the
species.
New York State DEC.
So that's exactly, you took the words right out of my mouth. Number 4, it's under no circumstances shall any site include plant material that is considered by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation to be a prohibited and regulated invasive species per New York State law.
Molly, great minds think alike.
Thanks, I'll take that as compliment. All right, so that's all of what we had to go through this section. I just want to make sure, so my intention is to take, like I said, the performance-based overlay district and adapt that into your plan development and not include incentive. Is that the consensus of the board?
Yep.
Then the last other things is we will jump back to part 4 for your questions, Lily. Or 3, I'm sorry.
Do we have part 3?
I sent it previously, I'm not sure it's printed out,
Oh,
but we
okay.
can, hopefully I can. Okay, so the first, since it's right here and it fits on one page, maybe we'll do this one first. Sketch plan pre-application conference.
It was pointed out to me that should be two separate things. The sketch plan review for major projects, let me see how she said this again, is a pre-application conference. It is not a chat. It does not include elected officials. It is a pre-application, part of the pre-application process meeting. Technical information only. The village should develop a list or a booklet that the building department utilizes to give to the applicant. It's a process that does not happen in public. It points out how the project might fit into existing zoning. It points out if variances are required. It's completely technical. So it would include only the planning board chair, the code enforcement officer, and the HBRB chair. As the separately from that would be the sketch plan conference. And that is for major projects. That does happen in public, and it's the first step. And then whatever, because she felt that it was sort of combined here, it should be separate. But there was, it's about process, deadlines, and that's the first part.
I think
And then
she's fleshing
it's
that out.
different than that.
Yeah.
Because there's
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
it's almost
Are you seeing it
preliminary
differently?
Yeah, so do you think that I'm just asking, do you think that she's reacting to the municipalities that she works with who wrongfully do
It's possible.
sketch plan
Yeah.
and wanting to clearly delineate the difference between the closed door process and the open door process?
In the formal preliminary plan review.
Right.
But there was no confusion or
Yeah.
something. It was,
I can see her point, honestly, I can see her point in not wanting,
elected officials.
elected officials as part of this conversation.
Mhm.
And that's obviously an easy change to make. I can include some language that emphasizes that this is the technical aspects, making sure we have our ducks in a row, this is gonna be your process, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think, otherwise I think that this is the appropriate use of sketch plan.
Okay.
But you can,
No, I think, and I see,
Yeah.
as staff, I love Marine, but as staff, as a sort of former city planner on staff, city zoner on staff for the city of Rochester. I see exactly where she's coming from, but I also think that the elected.
She's almost doing like a sketch plan, but closed door thing, and then a PRC,
Yes.
and then a BRA.
Yeah, I can, in a perfect world, I agree with her that elected officials don't necessarily need to be on this, but I don't think it's bad if they are.
Okay.
Only because I think in a village, I think the elected officials have a really good pulse on opportunities, issues, things that are coming that planning, these other people may not be aware of.
The thing I see, and Lily, let's think this through and talk
Okay.
about it. Because I see this as like an opportunity to instill a vision and correct things early on before the applicant is committed to things. So if, say, they put a building in a diagonal that's out of whack with the context, we could say early on, that, you know, look around the street.
On the napkin
Yeah,
drawing
but she
before
really
it's.
felt that there's two separate parts of the same process. In other words, that the very first step was, here you're coming with this question, and the building department is saying to you, well, A, you don't have the setbacks, you need a
I know
variance,
what
you
she's-
this, you know, all the technical aspects, which,
So
which
she's.
you're not talking about vision here or how it fits in the character, your nuts and bolts, this is permitted, this is not permitted.
Well, for example, if now, here, let's just use the Milroy project because it was the last big project that came into
She's
the
said
village.
in the pre-application conference on the sketch plan.
Is that, you know, the building inspector should have caught that, you know, a third of the project was in the conservation easement.
Well, he did,
Do we want to?
Oh, okay, well, all right, but
yeah,
that,
in a letter, and they,
No.
that was exactly the process that was followed.
Mhm.
And they came before the building department, the building department
Oh, no.
sent them a letter and said, you have these 6 outstanding issues, all technical issues. You cannot come before any board until you have resolved these 6 issues. So that was the proper one. There was no involvement
I agree.
of any trustees, any board, and no one.
well, I like the isolation of that because it
I got a
separates
question for you.
the trustees from, you know, the work of the building inspector of, you know, those are black and white issues.
That's what she's talking about.
And so, but I guess she's saying, and I'll talk this through with her on Saturday, but it sounds like she's saying that this meeting is, and it shouldn't be called a sketch plan meeting, but it's really a
The pre-application conference. So
Yes, I
she's looking at
Semantics, she's talking about
Yes.
semantics.
Yes, and
The
the
fact
one
that
thing,
it's blended.
yes, and the one thing I would say, we did intentionally blend them because we talked about not wanting a project to just go before one specific board for a preliminary conversation of the sketch, right? Because if the planning board's gonna be looking at the site plan, HPB is gonna be looking at ultimately the design, the elevation to be the final say, and you have village board being an optional board that you can go in front of. Now you've got 3 different bodies who potentially could have different opinions on the whole thing. So the idea is we're not required, you can literally draw your thoughts on a napkin and request to come in and talk to these people to have this conference, and it's to achieve both of those purposes because we don't want an applicant to be getting direction from a singular board entity.
No, and I think that she said this is technical only. That's what she
But
was.
we're blending.
Okay. She's good with that. Whatever, you know, whatever you guys are.
It's essentially, and I can make it more clear. I mean,
I think that-
I can make it read as sort of a two-faced thing.
It could be a semantic.
But I mean, the one thing I do disagree with her is that the sketch plan review piece shouldn't necessarily be at a meeting of one of the boards because you do want all of these voices at the table.
No, she was very clear on that as well, that this is, it can take place in public. It's not a public hearing, no public input, and it was no chats. So nobody is coming away with any kind of opinion about whether you like it or you don't like it. That's not the place for this. That was what she wanted to make very clear, that it was not a place for opinions. That it was
So,
about technical aspects only.
what I will do is I'll pull out the pre-application conference piece
Okay.
as the technical stuff, and then we'll provide for the sketch plan, and we'll pull the elected officials out of the pre-application conference. part, because that is essentially then
The building
just,
department.
yep,
Just
building
the
department and, you know,
Do you understand why, what we're saying, Bob?
I do.
That's
I
how
do.
it happened the first one, which was absolutely right, because the trustees were not a part of it, no board was a part of it, so no one could point to them afterwards and say, well, you didn't like it and that's why it's.
And I think it makes total sense, because it protects village board members, so they can't be accused of bias.
So they haven't even looked at it, because it's not ready to be
Right.
looked at.
I think a prohibition from them,
Yes.
communicating
department sees it
or,
first.
being there makes total sense.
Yes.
okay, all right. And
And so
then,
secret one.
Yeah.
The thresholds, we wanted to come up with specific, a list, and I know
yes,
we have to do that,
yes,
yes.
yep,
And so,
We're gonna do it next
And our next-
Tuesday at our next zoning meeting.
okay.
okay,
And
So what I would just.
demolition will be one.
Okay, so what I would suggest for that is, because this is copied from the new seeker, so I would go through essentially each of these by line item and decide whether you agree or you disagree, or you're gonna modify that number,
so this
essentially.
is page 5.
So this is page 5 of part 3,
Right, so we can just go there on Tuesday.
Yep. and that way you can just say, all right, yep, 25 acres is too big in the village, we're gonna scale that down to whatever. And,
Which we will.
Okay, thank you.
okay, so that's
Just
that's all.
remember
Well,
that you can't put something on the type 1 that's on the type 2 list.
correct.
Right, but these are.
And type 2 is after this also, so if you have a question, oh, just kidding, it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, but if you don't have access to it, we can send it.
We have access, we'll just go online.
And I can just double check too when you let me know what that
Right.
thought is, so.
Right.
And the only other thing I wanted to let everyone know, if you hadn't seen through the grapevine, the design center is bringing in the head of the Congress of Urbanism.
What, bringing what?
Andres Kawani?
No, it's executive director.
Oh, okay.
So it's Lynn Richards.
When?
The 22nd. They're not doing the evening presentation, it's a luncheon. It starts at 11:30 to 12. I always put my calendar a little early, at the Memorial Art Gallery.
This is the May 22nd?
Correct.
Okay.
Having lunch with
What is this, John?
It's the executive director for the Congress for New Urbanism is coming to town, and I've seen her speak, and she's great. I thought you might be
Also,
interested.
John, right,
Yes, a big drunk with her in Holland, which is really fun. But,
We have a leadership meeting, Lily, I think that day.
What is it?
It's the 22nd, and I have a leadership meeting at 11:30 on my calendar. Town Middle School,
Oh, we might hear leadership meeting.
here.
I believe it's a village hall for
Would you
lunch.
mind going for me if I go to this?
Sure.
I
Can
think
I
I'd
eat your
like-
lunch too?
What- You can eat my lunch.
That's awesome.
So, just remember, when you're looking at part 2, don't look at the building and site design stairs. It's gonna be tempting, they're long,
We won't.
It's not worth it.
Thanks.
just don't.
We promise.
Already gone through them.
Thank you,
Well,
Bob.
that's what you get for doing your homework before class.
Wow, I got a